December 19, 1944. If General George Smith Patton hadn't made his impossible promise at Verdun that day, the entire United States Third Army would have been stopped dead in its tracks. Not delayed. Not slowed down. Stopped dead. The man they called Old Blood and Guts was about to make a declaration so audacious, so seemingly insane, that every general in that room thought he'd lost his mind. What he promised would require an army to do the impossible, to pivot 90 degrees, march through a blizzard, and attack an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. And he swore he'd do it in 72 hours. This is the story of how George Smith Patton shocked the Allied High Command and changed the course of World War II forever. The 19th of December, 1944. The stone fortress of Verdun, France, a place soaked in the blood of World War I, now hosted the most critical military meeting of World War II. Outside, snow fell in sheets. Inside, panic gripped the Allied commanders. 3 days earlier, on the 16th of December, 1944, Adolf Hitler had launched his final gamble, Operation Watch, on the Rhine. The world would know it as the Battle of the Bulge. 200,000 German soldiers, backed by 1,000 tanks, smashed through the Ardennes forest. They caught the United States forces completely off guard. Within 72 hours, German panzer divisions had driven 50 miles deep into Allied lines, creating a massive bulge in the front. Entire United States divisions were surrounded, cut off, bleeding. At the tip of that bulge sat the Belgian town of Bastogne, a critical road junction. If the Germans took Bastogne, they could split the Allied armies in half and race to Antwerp, the vital supply port. The 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles, held Bastogne with barely 10,000 men. They were surrounded by 50,000 Germans. Ammunition was running out. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded soldiers froze to death in foxholes. The weather was so brutal that Allied aircraft couldn't drop supplies. The paratroopers were dying by the hour. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, summoned his generals to Verdun. The situation was catastrophic. British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery wanted to retreat, consolidate, and counterattack in weeks, maybe months. General Omar Nelson Bradley looked grim. The room buzzed with desperate calculations and defensive strategies. Then General George Smith Patton walked in. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a nickname earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from safe headquarters. He wore his trademark pearl-handled revolvers, his jaw set like iron. While other commanders saw disaster, Old Blood and Guts saw opportunity. Eisenhower got straight to it. "George, the situation is critical. The Germans have broken through. Bastogne is surrounded. We need options." What George Smith Patton said next would echo through military history forever. But first, he needed to understand something that no one else in that room seemed to grasp. This wasn't a crisis. This was the moment the United States had been waiting for. "Ike," Patton said, his voice cutting through the worried murmurs, "the Germans have just handed us the greatest opportunity of this war. They've stuck their head in a meat grinder. Now we slam the handle." The room fell silent. Old Blood and Guts was about to make the impossible sound inevitable. Eisenhower leaned forward across the map table, his face grave. "George, I need the Third Army to disengage from its current offensive in the Saar, wheel 90 degrees north, march through the worst winter storm in 50 years, and hit the German flank. How long would that take?" This was the moment. Every general in the room knew what Patton was facing. The United States Third Army, Patton's army, was currently attacking east toward Germany. To pivot north meant pulling back 3 full corps, turning 6 divisions, numbering nearly 250,000 men, redirecting thousands of vehicles, reorganizing supply lines, coordinating new attack routes through ice and snow, and hitting a prepared enemy position. In good conditions, military doctrine said this would take at least 3 weeks. In a blizzard, with frozen roads and enemy resistance, it was theoretically impossible. Field Marshal Montgomery spoke up, his British accent dripping with skepticism. "Surely, General Patton, such a maneuver would require extensive planning. 10 days at minimum. More likely a fortnight." General Bradley shook his head. "George, be realistic. The weather alone." George Smith Patton cut him off. He'd already done the planning. While other generals were still absorbing the crisis, Old Blood and Guts had been 3 steps ahead. On the ride to Verdun, he'd worked out 3 separate attack plans, each with different numbers of divisions, different routes, different timelines. He'd already alerted his staff, His mind was a tactical computer running scenarios at lightning speed. 48 hours, Patton said. The room erupted. Impossible. Insane. Reckless. Eisenhower raised his hand for silence. George, did you say 48 hours? 48 hours from the word go. I can have 3 divisions moving north. Within 72 hours I'll attack with the 4th Armored Division leading. I'll punch through to Bastogne and break the siege. Old Blood and Guts stood there, unwavering, while generals who'd spent careers planning operations told him it couldn't be done. The mathematics were staggering. To move a single division required coordinating 10,000 men, 2,000 vehicles, and hundreds of tons of supplies. Patton was proposing to move 3 divisions simultaneously through a snowstorm, reorganize them into attack formation, and launch an offensive all within 3 days. You're talking about attacking with your flank exposed, Bradley warned. The Germans could cut you off. George Smith Patton's eyes flashed. Brad, my flanks are something for the enemy to worry about, not me. This was why they called him Old Blood and Guts. While cautious commanders saw risk, Patton saw the enemy's throat exposed. While others calculated probabilities of failure, Old Blood and Guts calculated how fast he could kill. Gentlemen, Eisenhower said slowly, if General Patton says he can do it, I believe him. George, you have your orders. Relieve Bastogne, whatever it takes. George Smith Patton snapped a salute. Consider it done, Ike. The Krauts are already defeated. They just don't know it yet. Next time stand. Let's basic. As he strode out of that fortress in Verdun, Old Blood and Guts had just made the most audacious promise in military history. Now came the impossible part. Actually doing it. Could George Smith Patton really pull off the impossible? The next 72 hours would determine the fate of thousands of United States soldiers, the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, and the legend of the man they called Old Blood and Guts. The morning of the 20th of December, 1944, while snow buried Bastogne and German artillery pounded the surrounded paratroopers, 300 miles south, organized chaos erupted across the United States, Third Army. Staff officers who'd expected routine orders were handed plans marked top secret. Division commanders received coded messages: halt current operations, prepare to move north immediately. Supply sergeants scrambled to redirect fuel convoys. Engineers cleared snow from roads that hadn't seen traffic in weeks. Tank crews fired up engines that had been dug into defensive positions for months. This was George Smith Patton's genius on full display. While he'd stunned the generals at Verdun with his 48-hour promise, the truth was even more impressive. He'd anticipated this exact scenario days earlier. When German intelligence reported unusual Third Army movements on the 17th of December before the Verdun conference, they couldn't understand why Patton was already repositioning units. Old Blood and Guts had smelled the German offensive coming. His staff thought he was paranoid. History would prove he was prophetic. By midday on the 20th of December, the 4th Armored Division, 11,000 men, 300 Sherman tanks, was rolling north. The 26th Infantry Division followed, then the 80th, 3 entire divisions, each a small army, turning on a dime. It was the largest rapid redeployment in military history. But movement was only the first challenge. Now came the weather. The winter of 1944 was the coldest in European memory. Temperatures plunged to 15 degrees below zero. Snow fell continuously. Roads became ice sheets. Vehicles skidded into ditches. Men developed frostbite within minutes. Tank engines froze solid. Radios failed. Visibility dropped to zero. On the 21st of December, 1944, the columns ground forward at a crawl. German reconnaissance pilots, grounded by the same weather, missed the massive American movement entirely. Patton's luck or his genius for exploiting conditions held, but inside Bastogne, time was running out. The acting commander of the surrounded forces, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, received a German surrender ultimatum on the 22nd of December. His one-word reply became legendary: nuts. But bravado couldn't stop artillery shells or feed starving soldiers. McAuliffe's men were down to 10 rounds per artillery piece. Medical tents overflowed with frozen wounded. Every officer knew they had maybe 48 hours before the position became untenable. McAuliffe radioed Third Army headquarters. "Where is Patton?" Old Blood and Guts was everywhere. He drove his jeep up and down the columns, ignoring snipers and weather, screaming encouragement at cold, exhausted soldiers. When a traffic jam clogged a critical crossroads on the night of the 22nd of December, George Smith Patton personally directed traffic for 3 hours in sub-zero cold, waving tanks forward with his pearl-handled pistols, cursing creatively, inspiring men by sheer force of will. "Get moving!" he roared at one hesitant tank commander. "There are American soldiers dying in Bastogne while you sit here with your thumb up your ass. Move!" The column moved. By the evening of the 22nd of December, 1944, 72 hours after the Verdun conference, the 4th Armored Division reached the assault line 5 miles south of Bastogne. Patton had kept his promise. Against every military probability, Old Blood and Guts had repositioned his army and was ready to attack. But the hardest part still lay ahead. Now he had to break through. The German forces surrounding Bastogne weren't just blocking the roads, they'd fortified every approach with mines, artillery, dug-in Panther tanks, and elite Panzer Grenadiers. Intelligence estimated 5,000 Germans directly in the 4th Armored's path, backed by heavy guns. Military doctrine said attacking fortified positions required 3-to-1 numerical superiority. Patton was attacking with even odds, in a blizzard, across frozen ground. "Impossible," staff officers muttered. George Smith Patton overheard. "Gentlemen," he said coldly, "the word impossible doesn't exist in the Third Army vocabulary. Now get those tanks moving, or I'll find officers who will." At 0600 hours on the 23rd of December, 1944, United States artillery opened fire. The ground shook. Then the Sherman tanks charged forward through the snow, and the Battle of the Bulge entered its decisive phase. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Because when everyone else saw walls, George Smith Patton saw doors. And he kicked them down with American steel. The 23rd of December, 1944, dawned with clear skies, the first break in the weather in a week. The sudden visibility was both blessing and curse. Allied fighter bombers could finally fly, smashing German positions. But German gunners could also see the advancing United States tanks. The 4th Armored Division attacked in 2 columns. Combat Command A took the western route through Martelange. Combat Command B drove up the center toward Bastogne. Both columns ran straight into concentrated German resistance. At Warnach, a tiny village 3 miles from Bastogne, 12 German Panther tanks and 2 battalions of infantry turned the road into a killing field. United States Shermans burned. Infantry squads went to ground. The advance stalled. George Smith Patton drove to the front, ignoring artillery fire falling around his jeep. He found Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, behind a disabled Sherman, studying maps. "What's the holdup, Abe?" Patton demanded. Abrams gestured toward Warnock. "Sir, the Germans have that village locked down tight. I've lost 4 tanks already. If we keep pushing straight in, we'll lose the battalion." Old Blood and Guts studied the terrain for exactly 30 seconds. Then he pointed at a snow-covered ridgeline flanking the village. "Take your best platoon up that ridge. When you get position, radio me. Then hit them from the high ground while your main force attacks head-on. Crush them between hammer and anvil." "Sir, that ridge is mined." "Then clear the goddamn mines. We don't have time for caution. Bastogne doesn't have time. Move." Abrams moved. Within 2 hours, United States tanks crowned the ridge. German defenders, caught in crossfire, broke. Warnock fell. The road opened. But Combat Command A, on the western route, faced worse. At the village of Chaumont, an entire German panzer battalion waited in ambush. The lead United States column drove straight into it. Within minutes, 18 Sherman tanks were burning hulks. The survivors pulled back, bloodied and stunned. Back at 3rd Army headquarters, staff officers brought Patton the bad news. The Western attack had failed. Casualties were mounting. Maybe they should consolidate, try again tomorrow with better reconnaissance. George Smith Patton's response was instant and profane. "We don't consolidate. We don't wait for tomorrow. Those paratroopers in Bastogne are dying right now. Tell Combat Command A to bypass Chaumont, swing east, and link up with Abrams. Tell Abrams to punch through tonight. I don't care if he has to drive over German corpses to do it. Break through to Bastogne before midnight or heads will roll. Starting with mine." This was Old Blood and Guts at his essence, refusal to accept any obstacle, any excuse, any delay. Where other commanders saw tactical complexity, George Smith Patton saw one simple truth. Americans were dying, and his job was to save them. Everything else was irrelevant details. At 1650 hours 10 minutes to 5 in the afternoon on the 26th of December, 1944, First Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 37th Tank Battalion rolled his Sherman through the German lines at the village of Assenois and made radio contact with the 101st Airborne. "Come here!" a paratrooper screamed, waving frantically. "This is it!" Bogus's tank crashed through the final German roadblock. Behind him, the entire column poured through. The siege of Bastogne was broken. George Smith Patton received the message at his headquarters. He'd done it. In exactly 7 days from the Verdun conference, faster than his own audacious 72-hour promise for the initial attack, Old Blood and Guts had repositioned an army, broken through, prepared German defenses, and relieved the surrounded garrison. When Eisenhower called to congratulate him, Patton's response was pure George Smith Patton. "Ike, I told you I'd do it. The Third Army doesn't make promises. We make facts." Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers who'd held the line against impossible odds now witnessed something just as impossible. George Smith Patton's tanks rolling down the streets, bringing ammunition, medical supplies, and hope. One wounded paratrooper, watching the Shermans approach, said what thousands thought. "Old Blood and Guts came through. I knew he would." But the story doesn't end with the relief of Bastogne. What happened next proved why George Smith Patton was the greatest combat commander in United States history. The relief of Bastogne on the 26th of December, 1944, turned the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. But while other generals would have paused to consolidate, Old Blood and Guts did the opposite. He attacked. While German forces were still reeling from the breakthrough, George Smith Patton threw more divisions into the battle. The 6th Armored Division, the 35th Infantry Division, the 90th, the United States Third Army didn't just relieve Bastogne, it shattered the entire southern shoulder of the German offensive. Within 2 weeks, Hitler's last gamble had failed catastrophically. The German army lost 120,000 men, 600 tanks, and its ability to launch offensive operations. The road to Berlin was open, and everyone knew who'd broken the back of the German assault. General Dwight David Eisenhower, in his after-action report, wrote, "The most brilliant operation we have yet performed, and it is all due to General Patton." British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, no fan of brash American generals, admitted, "Patton's achievement defies military logic. What he accomplished should not have been possible." But the most telling tribute came from the enemy. Captured German officers, interrogated after Bastogne, expressed the same sentiment again and again. They didn't fear Montgomery. They respected Bradley. But they were terrified of George Smith Patton. One Wehrmacht general said, "When we heard Patton's Third Army was coming north, we knew the offensive had failed. You cannot stop Old Blood and Guts. He attacks like a force of nature." The German commander who'd surrounded Bastogne, General Heinrich von Leutwitz, later wrote in his memoirs, "Patton's relief of Bastogne was the fastest, most aggressive armored operation I witnessed in the entire war. If all American generals fought like him, Germany would have surrendered in 1943. This was the legend of George Smith Patton, an army that moved faster, hit harder, and thought sharper than any other force in World War II. Old Blood and Guts didn't just win battles, he rewrote the rules of mobile warfare. The United States Third Army's official history recorded the Bastogne relief with understated pride. From December 19th to December 26th, 1944, the Third Army pivoted 90 degrees, marched 150 miles through the worst weather conditions in memory, and broke through heavily defended German positions to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. Casualties: 600 killed, 2,000 wounded. Enemy casualties: estimated 12,000. Result: complete operational success. But behind those dry statistics lay the reality. Thousands of United States soldiers who would have died without George Smith Patton's audacity, aggression, and absolute refusal to accept the word impossible. General Anthony McAuliffe, the defender of Bastogne, who'd replied "nuts" to German surrender demands, met Patton personally after the relief. "George," he said, "you saved 10,000 men." Old Blood and Guts, never one for sentimentality, replied, "Tony, I didn't save them. You held them together. I just opened the door. Now let's go kill some more Krauts." That was George Smith Patton. Always forward, never satisfied, eternally aggressive. While the Battle of Bastogne made headlines, he was already planning the next offensive, the next attack, the next impossible operation that other generals would say couldn't be done. The United States Army studied the Bastogne relief for decades afterward. It became required reading at West Point. NATO war colleges analyzed it. Soviet military theorists called it the perfect example of maneuver warfare. Modern military GPS systems and instant communication make large-scale troop movements easier, but even today, military planners acknowledge that what George Smith Patton did in December 1944, with paper maps, radio communication, and sheer force of will remains one of the most impressive logistics and combat operations ever executed. And it all started with an impossible promise at Verdun. Today, when military historians rank the greatest generals in United States history, George Smith Patton consistently appears in the top three. His aggressive tactics, his understanding of mobile warfare, his ability to inspire soldiers to superhuman efforts, all of it crystallized in those 7 days between the Verdun Conference and the relief of Bastogne. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Not because he was reckless, though his boldness terrified cautious colleagues. Not because he was simply aggressive, though his attacks were relentless. They called him Old Blood and Guts because he embodied the warrior spirit that wins wars, the absolute conviction that will can overcome circumstance, that speed trumps strength, that audacity defeats preparation. When George Smith Patton stood in that fortress at Verdun on the 19th of December, 1944, and promised to do the impossible, he wasn't boasting. He was stating a fact that everyone else hadn't yet grasped. The United States Third Army didn't know how to fail because Old Blood and Guts wouldn't allow it. The soldiers who served under him understood this. They cursed his demands. They complained about his relentless pace. They joked that our blood, his guts, was closer to the truth. But when German shells fell and enemy tanks appeared, those same soldiers attacked with ferocious confidence because they knew George Smith Patton would never send them somewhere he wouldn't go himself. And he proved it again and again. At Bastogne, while staff officers planned from warm headquarters, Old Blood and Guts was at the front, standing in the open during artillery barrages, directing traffic, inspiring frozen soldiers, making victory seem inevitable through pure force of personality. The promise at Verdun shocked every general in that room because military doctrine said it was impossible. But George Smith Patton didn't fight according to doctrine. He fought according to one principle. Attack, attack, attack. Keep the enemy reeling. Never give them time to recover. Hit them when they're strong, and they'll break. Hit them when they're weak, and they'll shatter. That philosophy, combined with tactical genius and inhuman drive, made Old Blood and Guts the most feared Allied general in the European theater. While Montgomery planned meticulously and moved cautiously, Patton attacked instantly and moved like lightning. While Bradley coordinated methodically, George Smith Patton improvised brilliantly. The United States Army had many fine generals in World War II, but it had only one George Smith Patton, and that made all the difference. The men of the 101st Airborne who survived Bastogne carried one truth with them for the rest of their lives. Old Blood and Guts kept his word. When the situation was desperate, when death seemed certain, when everyone else saw hopelessness, George Smith Patton saw an opportunity to attack. And he did. And he won. That's the legend. That's why 75 years later, we still tell his stories, still study his battles, still marvel at what he accomplished with determination, aggression, and unshakable confidence. The impossible promise at Verdun wasn't just a tactical plan, it was a declaration of character. George Smith Patton was telling the world, there are no impossible missions, there are only commanders who lack the will to attempt them. Old Blood and Guts had the will. And 10,000 United States soldiers lived because of it. If this story of Old Blood and Guts, legendary relief of Bastogne moved you, hit subscribe. We're bringing you more untold moments from General George Smith Patton, history's greatest combat commander. Drop a comment about what makes Patton legendary, and share this with anyone who needs to hear about true military genius. Thanks for watching. And remember, when everyone else saw impossible, Old Blood and Guts saw opportunity.